In the opulent world of the elite, two sisters, bound not by blood but by a shared past, find their lives entwined in a web of love, jealousy, and dark ambition. One has it all: the voice of an angel, a loving husband, and a life of gilded ease. The other has a voice that can captivate nations and a heart consumed by a venomous envy. When a forbidden desire ignites, it sets in motion a devastating plan where sisterly affection curdles into a deadly rivalry. How far will a rising star go to step out of the shadows and claim the life she covets? The answer lies in a symphony of seduction, a meticulously planned betrayal, and a final, poisonous note. The late afternoon sun, the color of warm honey, streamed through the Palladian windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. It was a light that seemed to bless everything it touched, from the intricate scrollwork of the gilded ceiling to the deep, lustrous patina of the mahogany grand piano that dominated the music room. At the piano sat Alara, her fingers flying across the ivory keys, each note a perfect, crystalline utterance. Her voice, a mezzo-soprano of breathtaking range and power, filled the cavernous room, weaving a sorrowful Italian aria about a love lost to the sea. Her foster sister, Lyra, sat curled in a velvet armchair nearby, a half-finished embroidery hoop lying forgotten in her lap. Her eyes, the soft blue of a summer sky, were fixed on Alara with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. To Lyra, Alara was not just a sister of circumstance, but a creature of celestial talent, a nightingale destined for the world's grandest stages. They had arrived at Blackwood Manor as children, two orphan sparrows taken under the wing of the aloof but generous philanthropist, Mr. Alastair Finch. He had provided them with everything: education, comfort, security, but his presence was more that of a benefactor than a father, leaving the girls to forge their own bond in the lonely splendor of the estate. And forge a bond they did, though it was one of a stark and ever-growing imbalance. Lyra, with her gentle nature and quiet disposition, had always existed in Alara's shadow. It was Alara who was praised for her prodigious musical gifts, Alara who commanded the attention of every room she entered, Alara whose ambition burned like a star, fierce and hot. Lyra didn't mind. She was the moon to Alara's sun, content to reflect her sister's brilliance and offer quiet, unwavering support. She saw Alara's ambition not as a threat, but as a promise of the greatness her sister deserved. The final, heart-wrenching note of the aria hung in the air, vibrating with a palpable sorrow before fading into silence. "Oh, Alara, that was exquisite," Lyra breathed, her hands clasped together. "You sound more beautiful every day. Soon, all of London will be at your feet." Alara's hands dropped from the keys. She turned on the bench, a carefully constructed smile gracing her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes, a striking shade of emerald green, held a depth that Lyra mistook for artistic passion but was, in reality, a roiling sea of hidden resentments. "Thank you, Lyra. But what good is a voice if it's only ever heard within these four walls?" "Patience, dear sister," Lyra said soothingly, rising from her chair and crossing the Persian rug to sit beside Alara on the bench. "Julian is doing everything he can. You know he is." The mention of his name was like a key turning in a lock. Julian Croft, Lyra's husband of 2 years, was the man who had, in Alara's view, disrupted the delicate ecosystem of their lives. He was everything a woman was supposed to desire: handsome, wealthy, and influential in the city's art and music circles. His family's name opened doors that remained firmly shut to even the most talented of unknowns. When he had first come to Blackwood to consult with Mr. Finch on a philanthropic arts foundation, both sisters had been charmed. But it was gentle, unassuming Lyra he had pursued. He claimed to be captivated by her kindness, her serene grace, her quiet strength. He saw her as an anchor in his tumultuous world of high-stakes finance and society politics. Alara had been stunned. She was the star, the one with the electrifying talent. How could he have chosen the placid moon over the radiant sun? The day Lyra married Julian, a bitter seed of jealousy was planted in Alara's heart. She had smiled, played the role of the devoted sister and maid of honor, and even sang a piece at their wedding that brought tears to every eye. But inside, she felt a profound sense of injustice, as if she had been robbed of a prize she hadn't even realized she was competing for. Now, living with them at Blackwood Menorah wedding gift from Mr. Finch, who spent most of his time abroad, Alara was a constant, intimate witness to the life she believed should have been hers. She saw the easy affection between Lyra and Julian, the way he would touch the small of her back as they entered a room, the soft, private smiles they exchanged over the dinner table. And with every loving glance, the seed of jealousy within her grew, sprouting thorny vines that wrapped around her heart. "I know he is trying," Alara conceded, her gaze dropping to the piano keys. She began to play a soft, improvisational melody, a tune that was melancholic and searching. "It's just hard, watching you so happy, so settled. I feel adrift, Lyra." Her voice was a masterclass in feigned vulnerability. Lyra's heart went out to her. She put a comforting arm around Alara's shoulders. "Your time will come. I know it will. And we are here for you, both of us. Julian thinks the world of your talent. He told me just last night that your voice has a quality he's never heard before, a haunting fire," he called it. A tiny, triumphant spark ignited in Alara's chest. Haunting fire. So he did notice. He wasn't as blind to her as she had feared. This was the first crack in the facade, the first hint that her power was not entirely lost on him. Later that evening, the trio sat down for dinner in the grand dining hall, the long, polished table reflecting the flickering candlelight from a silver candelabra. Julian, loosening his tie after a long day in the city, was recounting a tedious board meeting. He was a man in his early 30s, with dark, intelligent eyes and an easy confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. Yet, around Alara, that confidence seemed to fray at the edges. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the way her green eyes would watch him when he spoke, of the almost imperceptible challenge in her gaze. And so, after 2 hours of arguing about funding allocations, we finally agreed to postpone the decision, he concluded, taking a sip of his wine. He looked at Lyra, and his expression softened. "How was your day, my love?" "It was lovely," Lyra said, smiling. "Alara sang for me this afternoon. She's been working on the new aria from Verdi. It was breathtaking." Julian's gaze shifted to Alara. "I'm sorry I missed it." "There will be other times," Alara said, her voice smooth as silk. She took a delicate sip of her own wine, her eyes holding his over the rim of the glass. "Perhaps I could sing for you privately sometime, when you're not so exhausted from the thrilling world of funding allocations." There was a subtle charge in her words, a playful intimacy that was just a shade too familiar. Lyra, ever trusting, noticed nothing, simply nodding in agreement. "That's a wonderful idea. It would relax you, Julian." Julian gave a tight, polite smile, but a faint flush crept up his neck. "Of course. I'd like that very much." The seduction began not with a grand, dramatic gesture, but with 1,000 tiny, calculated moments just like this one. It was in the way Alara would accidentally brush her hand against his when reaching for the salt. It was in the way she would recount a childhood story about her and Lyra, subtly painting herself as the adventurous, passionate one and Lyra as the timid, fragile homebody. It was in the music she chose to play late at night, when she knew he was in his study, the passionate, yearning melodies seeping through the walls, a siren's call he couldn't ignore. One evening, a week later, Lyra retired to bed early with a headache. Alara, claiming she was too restless to sleep, had wandered into the library. She found Julian there, staring into the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. She was wearing a dressing gown of emerald silk that matched her eyes and clung to her figure in a way that was both elegant and deeply suggestive. "A difficult day?" she asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet of the room. He started slightly, turning to face her. "Alara, I thought you'd gone to bed." "I couldn't sleep," she said, gliding further into the room. She stood near the hearth, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her face and making her hair gleam like polished copper. My mind is too full of music, of things. He watched her, mesmerized. She was so different from Lyra. Where Lyra was calming, a gentle harbor, Alara was a storm, crackling with an energy that was both intimidating and intoxicating. What kind of things? He asked, his voice huskier than he intended. Ambition, she said, her gaze intense. Wanting something so badly you can taste it. Wanting to be seen for what you truly are. Do you ever feel that way, Julian? Her question was a direct strike, aimed at the core of him. He was a successful man, but he was also the son of a titan of industry, forever living in his father's long shadow. He was respected, but he often wondered if it was for his own merits or for his family name. Alara saw that flicker of insecurity in him, that hidden hunger for a recognition that was entirely his own, and she knew she had found her opening. All the time, he admitted, his voice low. She closed the distance between them, her scent a heady mix of jasmine and night air enveloping him. She reached out and, with a startling boldness, straightened his collar, her fingers lightly grazing the skin of his neck. The touch was electric, a jolt of forbidden energy that made the air between them thick and heavy. Lyra is a wonderful woman, Alara whispered, her eyes locked on his. She is good and she is kind. She sees the world in simple, beautiful colors. But she doesn't see the fire in you, Julian. Not the way I do. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. He was a ship caught in a sudden, powerful current, and all he could do was let it pull him under. The loyalty he felt for his wife, the genuine love and affection, was a distant shore he could see but no longer reach. In that moment, there was only the fire in Alara's eyes and the terrifying, exhilarating promise of being truly seen. She leaned in closer, her lips just inches from his. I see it, she breathed, because it's the same fire that burns in me. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime midnight, each resonant bell striking a blow against the silence, marking the moment when a sister's envy began its inexorable transformation into a lover's betrayal. The gilded cage of Blackwood Manor had just become a stage, and the first act of a deadly tragedy had begun. The kiss in the library was not a gentle surrender. It was a conquest. For Julian, it was the dizzying, terrifying fall from a precipice he hadn't realized he was standing on. For Alara, it was the first victorious note in a symphony she had only just begun to compose. When they finally broke apart, the air between them crackled with the unspoken. Guilt was etched on Julian's face, a stark contrast to the triumphant gleam in Alara's emerald eyes. He had betrayed Lyra, and the knowledge was a lead weight in his stomach. But Alara had no such afflictions. She felt only the intoxicating thrill of power, the confirmation that her magnetism was, as she had always suspected, irresistible. Their affair began in whispers and shadows, a clandestine choreography performed in the forgotten spaces of Blackwood Manor. It was a stolen touch in the tapestry-lined hallway as Lyra passed by in the adjacent room, a hurried, breathless kiss in the chilled air of the wine cellar, a silent meeting in the moon-drenched garden gazebo long after the house had fallen asleep. Each secret encounter was a thread, weaving them together in a web of conspiracy that felt, to Julian, like a tightening noose and, to Alara, like the rigging of a ship sailing towards its glorious destiny. Alara was a master of orchestrating these moments, creating a stark contrast between the two sisters in Julian's mind. With Lyra, his life was one of placid comfort, of gentle affection and predictable routine. It was safe, but it was beige. With Alara, it was a world of vibrant, dangerous color. She challenged his opinions on art, debated politics with a fiery intelligence, and shared her fierce ambition in a way that made his own world of finance seem dull by comparison. She was not just a lover. She was a conspirator in a life he secretly wished he was bold enough to lead. The psychological campaign against Lyra began with insidious subtlety. It was an art form of which Alara was a prodigy. She began to plant seeds of doubt, not in Julian's mind about Lyra, but in Lyra's mind about herself. Julian seems so distant lately, Lyra confided in Alara one afternoon as they arranged flowers in the morning room. I asked if everything was all right at work, and he barely answered. I feel as if there's a wall between us. Elara paused, tilting her head with a look of deep, sisterly concern. Oh, darling, I'm sure it's not you, she said, her voice a comforting balm. He's under such immense pressure. You know how he gets. Perhaps, and please don't take this the wrong way, perhaps you're being a little sensitive? You've seemed so tired lately. Maybe your worrying is making you see things that aren't there. When Lyra later hesitantly approached Julian, he, coached by Elara, played his part perfectly. A wall? Lyra, my love, I'm just exhausted, he said, feigning weariness. The last thing I need is to feel that I'm disappointing you at home as well. The pained look on his face struck Lyra to the core. Guilt washed over her. Elara was right. She was being selfish, sensitive. She was adding to his burdens. From that moment on, she began to internalize the narrative. Julian's distance was his stress, and her anxiety over it was her own failing. Elara's manipulation extended beyond the manor's walls. At a small dinner party hosted by Julian's family, she found a moment alone with Julian's influential mother, a formidable matriarch who had always been lukewarm towards the quiet Lyra. I do worry so about Lyra, Elara said, her voice a soft, conspiratorial whisper. She has such a delicate constitution, the pressures of being Mrs. Croft. I think she finds it all a bit overwhelming. She puts on such a brave face for Julian, of course. The seed was planted. Mrs. Croft now saw Lyra not as serene, but as fragile. Not as graceful, but as weak a liability for her ambitious son. The affair reached a critical point one rainy Tuesday evening. Lyra, feeling one of her now frequent headaches, had retired to her room. Emboldened, Elara had joined Julian in the music room. The storm outside mirrored the tempestuous energy between them. Elara was at the piano, playing a passionate, storm-tossed piece by Rachmaninoff. Julian stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his body heat a palpable presence. He leaned down, his lips finding the nape of her neck, and she arched back into his touch, her fingers faltering on the keys. At that exact moment, the doorknob turned. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Julian. He sprang back as if burned. Elara, however, was preternaturally calm. As Lyra pushed the door open, her face etched with concern at the sudden silence, she saw Julian standing awkwardly by the fireplace and Elara hunched over the piano, her shoulders shaking. Elara? What is it? Lyra asked, her headache forgotten. With perfect timing, Elara let out a choked sob. She turned, her face a mask of beautifully crafted despair, tears shimmering in her eyes. Oh, Lyra, I'm so sorry. I can't bear it anymore, she cried. My career, it's going nowhere. I feel so trapped, so useless. I was just telling Julian. I feel like I'm fading away in this house. Julian, stunned by her quick thinking, could only watch in awe. Lyra rushed to her sister's side, wrapping her in a hug. Oh, you poor thing. You're not useless, you're brilliant. She shot a look at Julian, a mixture of gratitude and gentle reproach. Thank you for being here for her, Julian. She tries to be so strong, but I know how much this hurts her. The suspicion that had flickered in Lyra's mind was instantly extinguished, replaced by a wave of guilt. She had nearly walked in on her sister's private breakdown, her husband's compassionate support. Her own anxieties seemed petty in comparison. Later that night, the close call sobered Julian. He found Elara in the library, the site of their first kiss. We can't go on like this, he said, his voice ragged. What we did tonight, lying to her. It's vile. It was necessary, Elara replied coolly, turning from the bookshelf she was perusing. I love you, Elara. God help me, I do. The fire in you. It's what I've been missing my whole life, he confessed, his voice breaking. But I can't leave her. I won't. She is my wife. She is a good, kind woman who has done nothing to deserve that kind of public humiliation and destruction. I took a vow. He envisioned a future for them, a lifetime of stolen moments, of her as his permanent, beloved secret. He expected tears, anger, a dramatic scene. Instead, Alara's face became very still. He had just handed down her sentence. She would always be the other woman, the mistress in the shadows, while Lyra, the bland, fragile Lyra, retained the title, the position, the life that Alara now knew should be hers. In that moment, Julian ceased to be her partner in passion and became merely an obstacle, rather, a prize to be won, with one final condition for its acquisition. "I understand," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "You need to do what you believe is right." He felt a wave of relief, mistaking her composure for resignation. He kissed her forehead and left the library, leaving her bathed in the soft glow of a single reading lamp. Alara did not move for a long time. The burning ambition inside her did not die. It merely cooled, hardening from a raging fire into a diamond-sharp point of resolve. If Julian was too weak to remove the obstacle from their path, then she would have to be strong enough for both of them. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the leather-bound spines on the shelves. They bypassed the poetry, the histories, the novels. They were searching for something practical, something forgotten. Her gaze landed on a small, dusty section of books left by Julian's great-grandfather, a physician with an interest in botany. Her fingers traced the gold lettering on a dark green volume, a compendium of English flora, their medicinal and toxicological properties. She pulled the book from the shelf. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her touch. She opened it, the old pages releasing a dry, earthy scent. Her fingers flipped past entries on lavender and rose, past chamomile and mint. They stopped on a page with a detailed, hand-colored illustration of a beautiful, bell-shaped flower, in shades of purple and pink, Digitalis purpurea, the common foxglove. The text beneath described its use in treating heart ailments in minute doses, and its ability to induce catastrophic cardiac arrest in larger ones. Its effects, the author noted, were often mistaken for a natural, sudden failure of a weak heart. A slow, deliberate smile touched Alara's lips. The symphony of deceit was over. It was time to compose the final aria. The first act of Alara's plan began not with a vial and a skull and crossbones, but with a trowel and a pair of gardening gloves. In a forgotten corner of Blackwood Manor's vast grounds, hidden behind a crumbling stone wall and overgrown with ivy, she cultivated a new, private garden. To the household staff, it was a charming new hobby for the artistic Miss Alara, a way to soothe her restless spirit. She planted lavender for its calming scent, roses for their beauty, and chamomile for tea. But in a secluded patch, shielded from casual view, she nurtured the beautiful, deadly spires of foxglove, their bell-shaped flowers nodding in the breeze like silent, purple secrets. She tended to them with the same meticulous care she devoted to her vocal scales, her devotion absolute, her purpose unwavering. The poisoning of Lyra began on a Monday, with a cup of chamomile tea. "You've been looking so dreadfully pale, my dear," Alara said, her voice dripping with concern as she carried the steaming cup into the drawing room where Lyra was listlessly reading. "I've brewed you some tea from my garden. It will help you relax." Lyra accepted it with a grateful smile. "That's so thoughtful of you, Alara." The tea tasted of chamomile and honey, with only the faintest, almost unnoticeable bitter aftertaste. Within the brew was a microscopic dose of a concoction Alara had painstakingly prepared from the foxglove leaves, a dose so small it would be medically undetectable, designed not to kill, but to cumulatively weaken. The effects were subtle at first. Lyra began to feel a profound and unshakable fatigue. She would fall asleep in the middle of the afternoon and wake up feeling as though she hadn't rested at all. She suffered from spells of nausea and dizziness, which she attributed to her persistent headaches. When she mentioned these symptoms, Alara was always there, ready with a diagnosis and a remedy. "It sounds like your nerves are frayed to pieces," Alara would say, stroking her sister's hair. "Let me make you another cup of my calming tea. You must rest." Alara became the perfect, doting caregiver. She was a constant presence at Lyra's side, fluffing her pillows, reading to her, and ensuring she drank her special tea 3 times a day. Her performance was so convincing that the entire household, including a worried but clueless Julian, saw her as a saint. Lyra, growing weaker and more confused by the day, clung to her sister as her only source of strength and comfort. Her world was shrinking, its borders defined by the walls of her bedroom, and Alara was the gatekeeper. Julian watched Lyra's decline with a spiraling sense of horror and guilt. The vibrant, if quiet, woman he had married was fading into a pale, listless ghost. He saw her struggling to climb the stairs, her hand trembling as she lifted a teacup to her lips. A dark, ugly suspicion began to fester in the back of his mind, a thought so monstrous he could barely allow himself to form it. He would watch Alara administer the tea with a loving smile and feel a cold dread creep up his spine. But what could he do? Accuse her? On what grounds? His own complicity in their affair had stripped him of any moral high ground. He was trapped. Alara sensed his suspicion and deftly turned it into another tool of manipulation. "She feels your unhappiness, Julian," she whispered to him one night, after he'd found her in the hall outside Lyra's room. "Your guilt over us is like a poison to her sensitive soul. It's making her ill. The only way she can get better is if she believes you are happy." The psychological genius of her statement was that it was, in a twisted way, true. His guilt was poisoning their marriage. By framing Lyra's physical decline as a psychosomatic symptom of his emotional betrayal, Alara made him a co-conspirator in his own wife's slow murder. To save Lyra, he had to pretend to be happy. To pretend to be happy, he had to continue his life with Alara. He was caught in a perfect, vicious circle. As Lyra became increasingly confined to her bed, Alara began to take her place at Julian's side in society. She was no longer the foster sister in the shadows, but a striking, tragic figure. Her beauty made all the more compelling by the story of her devotion to her ailing sister. Julian, playing his part, began to introduce her to his contacts in the music world. At a fundraising gala, he introduced her to Sir Victor Ellington, the most powerful and feared opera critic in London. "My sister-in-law, Alara. She is a singer of some talent," Julian said. Later that evening, goaded by guests who had heard rumors of her voice, Alara was persuaded to sing. She chose a dramatic, heart-wrenching aria of love and loss. As she sang, she pictured Lyra, pale and wasting away in her bed, and channeled all of her feigned grief and real, ruthless ambition into the music. Her voice filled the grand ballroom, a thing of exquisite power and pain. The performance was a triumph. Sir Victor was mesmerized. "My dear girl," he said to her afterward, his voice filled with awe, "that was not merely some talent. That was a revelation, a haunting fire." Indeed, the critics' praise was like gasoline on the fire of her ambition. Doors that had been sealed shut were now blown wide open. She was offered auditions, meetings, the promise of a recital. Her plan was working. Everything she had ever wanted was coming into focus, and the only price was the fading life of the sister who adored her. Concerned by Lyra's continued deterioration, Julian insisted on calling in a series of prominent doctors. They came and went, tapping Lyra's chest, peering into her eyes, and taking her pulse. They were uniformly baffled. Her heart showed a slight, unaccountable weakness, but there was no identifiable disease, no infection, nothing to explain the severity of her symptoms. The final specialist, a pompous man named Dr. Albrecht, sat with Alara and Julian in the library after his examination. "Physically," he declared, steepling his fingers, "there is very little wrong with Mrs. Croft. Her symptoms, however, are quite severe. It is my professional opinion that we are dealing with a case of nervous hysteria, a malady of the mind, not the body, though the physical manifestations are quite real." He recommended a quiet sanatorium in the Swiss Alps. Complete removal from her current environment is often the only cure. The diagnosis was a death sentence and a perfect alibi. That evening, Lyra, who had overheard the doctor, was distraught. When Alara came into her room with her nightly cup of tea, Lyra gripped her arm. Her blue eyes wide with terror and a flicker of something else, a nascent suspicion she could barely articulate. "He thinks I'm mad," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Julian, he's gonna send me away. Don't let them send me away, Elara. Please, you're the only one who's been here for me. You believe me, don't you? You believe that I'm really sick." Elara sat on the edge of the bed and took her sister's frail hand in both of her own. She looked directly into Lyra's desperate, searching eyes, her face a perfect portrait of unwavering love and loyalty. "Of course, I believe you," Elara said, her voice a soft, reassuring murmur. "And I will never let anyone send you away. You're staying right here, with us." She squeezed Lyra's hand. "Now drink your tea. It will help you sleep." The promise hung in the air, a final, chilling vow. Lyra would indeed be staying at Blackwood Manor. Forever. The night of Elara's debut recital was a convergence of all her ambitions. Sir Victor Ellington had championed her cause, and the result was a sold-out performance at the prestigious Aeolian Hall. All of London society, buzzing with the story of the tragic, talented prodigy and her mysterious, ailing sister, would be there. Elara had dedicated the performance to Lyra, a gesture the newspapers had lauded as an act of sublime sisterly devotion. On the morning of the recital, the air in Blackwood Manor was thick with a strange, funereal tension. Lyra was weaker than ever, a fragile porcelain doll propped up by pillows. Elara entered her room, carrying a tray. On it was not the usual cup of tea, but a small bowl of clear, nourishing broth. "You must have your strength for tonight, my love," Elara said, her voice bright and encouraging. "You have to be there. This isn't just my night. It's our night. It's the culmination of everything we dreamed of when we were little girls." Lyra managed a weak smile. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Elara sat beside her and spoon-fed her the broth, each spoonful a tender, loving motion. Within the warm liquid was the final, massive dose of digitalis, a concentration carefully calculated to be absorbed slowly, its devastating effects delayed for several hours. It was designed to mimic a sudden, catastrophic heart failure, leaving no trace of its chemical origins without a specific and suspicious toxicology screen. As Elara helped her sister dress for the evening in a gown of pale blue silk, she felt a profound and icy calm. This was the final act. There was no room for error, no space for sentiment. She was a performer preparing for the most important role of her life. At Aeolian Hall, a special chair had been placed for Lyra in the front row, directly in the center. She sat beside Julian, who looked gaunt and haunted, his tuxedo seeming to hang off his frame. He had argued against Lyra coming, insisting she was too weak, but Elara had been adamant. "It will give her hope," she had insisted, and he, as always, had acquiesced. Now, sitting beside his dying wife, Julian felt the crushing weight of the thousands of unspoken words, of the lies and betrayals that had led them to this moment. The applause that greeted him and Lyra felt like a judgment. Backstage, Elara was a vision in emerald green velvet, a perfect match for her eyes. She felt the familiar pre-show adrenaline, but tonight it was different. It was sharper, purer. It was the feeling of ultimate control. She was the conductor of every fate in this room tonight. When she walked onto the stage, the hall fell silent. Bathed in the warm glow of the gaslights, she was breathtaking. She smiled, a sad, brave smile, and nodded towards Lyra. The audience let out a collective sigh of sympathy and admiration. And then she began to sing. If her voice had been a revelation before, tonight it was a miracle. It soared through the hall, filled with a depth of emotion that was almost unbearable to witness. She sang of love, of hope, of despair. The audience believed they were hearing an artist channel her worry and grief for her sister into her music. They were half right. She was channeling emotion, but it wasn't grief. It was the fierce, ecstatic release of a lifetime of envy, the exultation of her impending victory. The final piece on the program was the same Italian aria she had sung in the music room for Lyra weeks before the lament for a love lost to the sea. She began the piece softly, her voice a thread of silver sorrow. She directed the entire performance at her sister. Her eyes never left Lyra's face. Lyra watched, mesmerized, her heart swelling with a fierce, painful pride. Her sister was a star. It had all been worth it. Julian, sitting beside her, felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He couldn't breathe. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was witnessing an execution. Alara's voice swelled, climbing towards the final, heart-shattering crescendo. As the note began to ascend, a strange look passed over Lyra's face. A flicker of confusion. She brought a hand to her chest. Her blue eyes, which had been fixed on Alara with adoration, suddenly widened. In that last, lucid second, as the music reached its zenith, the pieces seemed to click into place in her mind. The tea, her weakness, Julian's distance, Alara's constant, cloying presence. It was not adoration that filled her eyes in that final moment, but a look of profound, silent, devastating understanding. The ultimate betrayal. She let out a small, inaudible gasp. Her head fell to the side, her body slumping in the velvet chair. On stage, Alara held the final, perfect, crystalline note for an impossible length of time. The sound hung in the air, pure and tragic, before fading into an absolute, reverent silence. She held her pose for a single, dramatic beat. The silence was shattered not by applause, but by a raw, guttural scream. Lyra! Julian was on his feet, shaking his wife, his face a mask of primal horror. No! Oh God, no! The spell was broken. Pandemonium erupted. People shouted. Doctors from the audience rushed forward. But it was too late. Amid the chaos and the screams, Alara, her face a perfect portrayal of shock and grief, ran from the stage. She threw herself towards the front row, pushing through the crowd. "Sister!" she cried, her voice choked with sobs. She collapsed beside Lyra's chair, taking her limp hand. "No, no, please no." The audience, now on its feet, witnessed the final tragic tableau. The brilliant young singer, her night of ultimate triumph transformed into a nightmare, weeping hysterically over the body of the sister to whom she had dedicated her art. The death would be ruled a tragedy, a result of a mysterious, long-standing cardiac weakness finally giving way. No one saw the cold, triumphant glint that flashed for a brief second in Alara's tear-filled eyes. The performance was over, and it had been flawless. 6 months later, Alara was not just a star. She was a phenomenon. The tragic story of her debut recital had become the stuff of legend, lending her artistry a depth and pathos that critics adored and audiences craved. She was the nightingale born from sorrow, her voice a testament to beauty forged in pain. She had everything she had ever wanted. The fame, the adoration, the wealth. And she had Julian. Blackwood Manor was now hers. But the victory was hollow, the prize corroded. The opulent rooms, once a symbol of the life she coveted, now felt like a gilded tomb, echoing with a suffocating silence. The passionate, fiery affair that had driven her to murder had been extinguished by the act itself, its ashes a bitter mix of shared guilt and simmering resentment. Their dinners in the grand dining hall were silent, tense affairs. Julian drank heavily, the alcohol dulling the edges of his constant, simmering self-loathing. He had become a ghost in his own home, haunted by the memory of the woman he had allowed to be destroyed. Alara's triumph was poisoned from within. She began to hear things, the faint strains of a lullaby Lyra used to hum, the whisper of her name on the wind that rattled the old windows. She would catch a glimpse of pale blue silk in the corner of her eye or smell the phantom scent of Lyra's freesia perfume in an empty hallway. The hauntings were not supernatural. They were the projections of a psyche that could not escape its crime. The strain began to manifest in the one place she thought was inviolable, her voice. During rehearsals, she would sometimes feel a tightness in her throat, and a high note that had once been effortless would emerge with a slight, almost imperceptible waver. Julian, for his part, could no longer bear to hear her sing the Italian aria, the song that had been Lyra's death knell. One evening, finding her practicing it in the music room, he had hurled his brandy glass against the wall, shouting, "Stop it! For God's sake, just stop it!" The shared secret that was supposed to bind them together had become a chasm that was driving them apart. The unraveling began not with a bang, but with a quiet, methodical man named Inspector Davies. A distant cousin of Lyra's mother, he was a quiet, unassuming detective with Scotland Yard who had never been satisfied with the coroner's hasty report. The timing of the death, at the precise climax of Alara's recital, struck him not as tragic irony, but as theatrical convenience. He decided, on his own time, to start asking questions. He began with the staff at Blackwood Manor, most of whom had been let go after Lyra's death. A former housemaid, intimidated at the time but now free to speak, mentioned something she had thought odd. Miss Alara's strange, private herb garden. She was so particular about it, the maid recalled. Grew some lovely flowers. Foxgloves, I think they were. Pretty as a picture, but my grandmother always said they were poison. This was the first thread. It led Davies to the manor's library and to Julian's great-grandfather's collection. With a warrant in hand, he found the Compendium of English Flora. And there, on the page detailing the toxic properties of Digitalis purpurea, he found a single, faint fingerprint smudge in the margin, a smudge that would later be identified as Alara's. The final piece of the puzzle was found in Alara's own music cabinet. Tucked away behind a score of a Wagner opera, Davies found a small, leather-bound journal. It was not a confession. Alara was too clever for that. But it was a detailed, narcissistic chronicle of her growing frustration with Lyra's frailty and neediness, and a passionate account of her profound spiritual and intellectual connection with Julian. It was a narrative of self-justification, so completely lacking in empathy that it served as a perfect map of her motive. Davies presented his findings to Julian. He did not accuse. He simply laid out the facts: the garden, the book, the journal, the convenient death. He watched as the color drained from Julian's face. Julian Croft, a man broken by drink and self-hatred, finally reached his limit. The pretense shattered. In a torrent of words, a confession choked with sobs and bourbon, he told Davies everything. It was not an act of nobility, but the final, desperate act of a weak man seeking an end to his own private hell. The arrest took place 2 weeks later. Alara was in her dressing room at the Royal Opera House, preparing for the lead role in Lucia di Lammermoor. She was surrounded by bouquets of roses, the air thick with their scent. She was at the apex of her career, the queen of the London stage. A sharp knock came at the door. 5 minutes, Miss Vance, her manager's voice called. A second, harder knock followed. She opened the door, an impatient word on her lips, and found not her manager, but Inspector Davies and 2 uniformed constables. The roar of the expectant crowd was a dull murmur through the closed door. As Davies calmly read her rights, charging her with the murder of Lyra Croft, Alara's carefully constructed world collapsed into silence. The photographer's flashbulbs that erupted as she was led from the opera house in handcuffs were the last spotlight she would ever stand in. The final scene of her life was not set on a grand stage, but in a small gray cell. Stripped of her velvet gowns, her jewels, and her audience, she was left with nothing but the silence and the crime. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the guards would hear a sound coming from her cell. It was the sound of a woman humming. She was humming the Italian aria,